I finally watched Zack Snyder's new movie, Rebel Moon, Part 1, A Child of Fire. But I promise you, the only fire this movie offers is the one that's going to be ignited in your soul with rage over how awful it is and how angry it makes you for wasting over 130 minutes of your life. Do you remember all that hoopla a couple weeks ago where big fans of Zack Snyder were screaming and shouting from the rooftops about how unfair it is that Rebel Moon Part 1 has a low Rotten Tomatoes scores from critics? Then the claim started floating around that Rebel Moon was the victim of review bombing, so all the reviews that were being posted weren't genuine or reliable whatsoever, so you couldn't take the Rotten Tomatoes score as an indicator of it being bad, because it's actually extremely good, and that the critics' reviews here are just baloney. Well, that's a bunch of cope right there. That is the biggest lie ever told since me trying to pretend I was 6 feet tall on Tinder. This movie shouldn't even have a 24% on Rotten Tomatoes. That seems high. That is generous. How it has a 65% audience score is an affront to God himself, because this is not a good movie no matter how you spin it. It is extraordinarily derivative of just Star Wars itself to the point where it almost feels like it was supposed to be satirical of Star Wars, but if it was created by someone going through a really edgy phase in their life. I hate to draw the immediate and obvious connection to Star Wars, but it's very clear that had a huge influence here because there are so many plot elements that are directly shared with Star Wars, as well as just blatantly having a lightsaber ripoff. It's so shameless. There is a character in this movie that uses lightsabers. Come on. It's right in your face. Zack Snyder is pounding his meat into your mouth, letting you know that this is Star Wars fanfic done really poorly. Now, as I understand it, this was something Zack Snyder tried to pitch for quite a while and was constantly turned down until recently, where he was given the means to make it. And man, it should have stayed in the drafts. This should not have made it to the screen whatsoever. So let's dive in. Let's start with its disjointed plot and nonsensical subplots that it tries to introduce here. Now, I'm going to give you a brief synopsis, and it's going to sound really familiar to some property you've seen in the past. So if there's any copyright attorneys in here, you might start sweating when hearing this. There's an evil intergalactic empire that wants to control the whole galaxy, and they're bad news, Buster. You don't want them paying you a visit, because shit will pop off. And if things don't go their way on the planets they visit, if they don't want to serve the way that they think the planet should serve them, they have no hesitation blowing the planet up with their low orbit beams that will explode the planet. Our protagonist is one of the most fearsome warriors that empire had ever produced, but she left that life behind in order to live a life of solitude on an isolated planet elsewhere. But unfortunately, the ghosts from the past pay her a visit. The empire comes through, and in doing so, they cause a ruckus on this new planet that she's trying to call home, and thus she decides to rise up and lead a rebellion against this evil empire that she left so long ago. That's the bare bones of it. I don't even really care if it's like a super simple plot, to be honest, because you can make that work as long as you fill it with an interesting world and interesting characters, neither of which this movie successfully accomplishes. So, its characters are the most soulless I think I've ever seen in a sci-fi movie. They are so bland and emotionless. They don't have a personality at all. Zack Snyder forgot to write that. And he forgot to write the characters bonding with each other. So the whole film is basically just collecting new members for the rebellion for the most part. And when they do so, they join very easily. It doesn't take much convincing at all. It's not really feeling earned when they join. And when they're there, you don't ever see them interact with each other. They're all basically just fucking strangers to one another. I don't know how you can make a movie like this and forget the most important part, which is showcasing character bonding and building relationships. It doesn't even attempt to do that in any way. But anyway, these characters really don't have any kind of defining personality traits whatsoever. In fact, they all kind of share the exact same traits. They're all stoic, they're all brooding, and they're all mad all the time. And I don't even mean like outwardly mad, like screaming or anything. They don't even get that emotional. They're just always like angry, like wearing a big frown on their face because it's all so grim and dark in this universe. The only one of their crew that even somewhat has a personality is Kai. And he basically just becomes their chauffeur. He drives them around to collect new members for the rebellion. And that's kind of his whole role, and he sometimes makes some wise cracks. Thus, you can make an argument that there is at least a semblance of a personality to him, whereas everybody else has nothing. It's so weird how you could make a cast of characters this uninteresting. And what's wild is you don't even get to see them use their expertise. For example, one of the people that joined the rebellion is supposed to be this hotshot general. And the only reason you even know that this guy's a big deal is because when they're reflecting, the Empire's reflecting on this mounting rebellion, one of the big bad guys says, and then they have General Tiberius, I think is what it was. I'm already forgetting the names because, again, the characters are just not interesting. But he's like, General Tiberius is with them? You mean the genius general? One of our finest generals ever? And it's like, oh, okay, so he's a big deal. But he never uses that expertise at all when he joins the crew. He doesn't do anything. He doesn't do anything at all. Really, none of the characters do for the most part. So there's like a prince that joins, has no role to play in this group whatsoever, and him being a prince has no role to play in this whatsoever. The general doesn't use any of his expertise. Like, it just, they have all of these like subplots and all of these like tiddlywinks of lore that never go anywhere, and they kind of just serve as like bench players behind our main character as well as the main farmer that joins them. And the main farmer, like, he is probably the most personality-less out of all of them. So much bad shit happens to him, and some of it is, like, actually directly his fault, and he just sits there just super stone-cold stone-faced, and sometimes he'll do this. And that's it. Like, he doesn't... There's no depth to any of these characters. They don't flesh them out. They don't do anything with them. It's basically just like having action figures in your movie. And then occasionally Zack Snyder decides he wants to play with them, so he'll make some of the lamest action sequences you'll ever fucking see. He has this obsession with slow motion for this movie. I swear to God, at least 45 minutes of this film's runtime is dedicated to slow-mo shots. And they're so lame. It's like the most boring things you could ever use slow-mo for. One of them, I shit you not, is a character jogging. And he's jogging. And he's jogging. And he's jogging. And he's jogging. And then he finally jumps onto the back of a bird that threw him off. Like, it's just so, like, why slow-mo that? Slow-mo the jump. Don't slow-mo the entire jog up there. It is agonizing. Oh my God, it was miserable. I felt like I was in some kind of fucking time vortex. Like, just, it was actually, I actually felt like Zack Snyder wanted to personally offend me and waste my time with how much slow-mo he puts in here. You have to really fuck up to make slow motion boring. And somehow he pulls it off. Slow-mo has always been cool. It will always be cool when it comes to action moments. But he uses it for the worst action. Like, another good example. There is a slow-mo action sequence where our main character is running and sometimes firing. And that's it. Like, there's sometimes some, like, lasers going by her. But she doesn't do anything else. It's, again, just slow-mo of her running through these lasers with the occasional shot being fired, which you don't even see hitting anyone, and then eventually she slides under something. Why slow-mo that? That would be a lot more intense if you had that going at normal speed. She's dodging all of these lasers, it's really high stakes, it's really intense. This thing's collapsing and now she needs to slide to beat it. And she slides and just barely and narrowly gets through there. That'd be much better than this 3-minute sequence of her running towards that thing with like a few lasers zipping by her and occasionally her pulling the trigger. It's just, why slow-mo some of these things? I don't get it. I really don't. It feels like when you back were in school for a summer book report and you needed to reach the word limit, so you just start typing a bunch of mumbo-jumbled gobbledygook. That's what I feel like he used slow-mo here for, just to pad the runtime a bit longer, because I have no other explanation for it. But anyway, we'll move on from the lackluster action. I don't think it's all bad. There are some cool moments here, visually and in the action. And you know what the cool action moments have in common? They're not fucking slow motion. Like, their non-slow motion action was so much better than the sequences that they tried to slow down. So they should have worked more on that a bit. But there are a few cool moments. Some of the planets they visit are visually interesting. Like, I can really see Zack Snyder had this wild imagination that he wanted to bring to life, but didn't really know how. So it's kind of just this disjointed mess of visiting a bunch of places in Zack Snyder's brain with no real reason for them to be there narratively that feels rewarding or earned. So, like, there's this spider woman who eventually fights the lightsaber wielder, which I think is a really cool concept and a really cool idea. And in fact, the scene between them is pretty good, but the actual writing of it is terrible. The spider creature has a couple of minutes to try and make her like a sympathetic character, and then the lightsaber wielder who does join the rebellion has a couple of minutes to try and flesh her out in some way, and then they fight, and then that's it. We never really see the lightsaber character talk to anybody else ever again, so we get nothing else from the lightsaber character ever. The spider creature's dead. I guess spoilers, but it's not an important character anyway. It's just a throwaway, just to showcase some lightsaber action. And it's like, okay, you had this cool visual idea here with the spider creature fighting the lightsaber wielder. You needed something more to tie it together, because at the end of the day, like, this was kind of flashy and kind of nice, but there's no real substance there. We don't really get anything out of it for the rest of the film, and it's never addressed ever again in the film, so what the fuck did we really do this for? And there's a couple other moments like that where I'm like, damn, this is kind of a cool place they're visiting, this is a cool atmosphere. We spend 4 minutes there, never to come back, never to address any of it again, and the character that we got in the rebellion from it never says another word to anybody in the crew. So what a waste of time that was. And that's just what the whole movie feels like, a waste of time. There is nothing worthwhile in Rebel Moon Part 1. It doesn't set anything up that makes me like biting at my nails waiting to see what happens in Part 2. The villain super sucks. The villain is just cartoonishly evil, and that's his only trait, really. He doesn't have any depth to him either. Nobody and nothing does. Even the main character, the way that they try and write depth to her is by her monologuing her past, and then them showing the flashbacks. In slow motion, of course, obviously. But outside of her monologues, she doesn't do anything else besides just try and drive a hard bargain for people to join her rebellion. And by hard bargain, I mean she literally asks a couple of times, and then usually they say yes. Or she'll do like a very simple chore, and then they'll join. Like, it just feels so lame and underwhelming. I do think the universe has potential. Like, I do think they set up a pretty cool universe, and they introduce an interesting plot element that hasn't been explored in Part 1 at all when it comes to, like, potentially breathing life back into creatures, and potentially magic. And that could be pretty cool if this film was successful at all in generating any type of interest in seeing it explored more. I just don't know who would sit down and watch this and care about any of the characters at all. Like, again, they don't have personality. This whole movie is emotionless. It's all muted. There's a death amongst the rebel crew, and I guarantee there's not a single person out there that cared, because we had only met that character like 20 minutes ago. He only had like 3 or 4 lines in total, really, before he died, like after joining the crew. So it has no impact whatsoever. There's no weight to it. And that's just kind of the whole movie. And I also feel like the movie itself has an identity crisis, because it tries so hard to be dark and gritty, but it's also very clearly aimed at a PG-13 rating, because there's no blood or anything like that, and it pulls all of its punches. So our big evil guy, he has this big stick that he hits people with and kills them with it, but when he hits them with it, after the initial hit, it'll usually cut away to just a close-up of him slamming it down, and then it's implied they are dead because of it. Well, it's not implied, like they are dead because of it, but they don't show anything. Like, it doesn't actually go through with the dark and gritty tone. It pulls its feet out of the pool at the last second. So the whole film just really feels so messy. It really feels like all this film wanted to do was get to things that Zack Snyder thought would look cool, but he didn't really know how to write it in a way that makes sense to get there. So he said, fuck it, we'll just do it anyway. We'll do it live. And that's what it is. It's just this, you go here, recruit them, and leave. And while you're doing the going there and recruiting them, you look at something cool. Maybe there's a cool scene that unfolds, like riding a griffin or something, and then you immediately leave, and then that character that joins you never hear from again. It's just a bad movie, really. Like, there's just not a whole lot that's good about it. I think Zack Snyder has some cool ideas, but he needs someone to really fine-tune that shit and put good writing behind the ideas. So, yeah. Rebel Moon Part 1, Child of Fire. It is pretty bad. I'd say it's about as bad as everyone's saying that it is. That's about it. So, yeah. Rejoice, it's finally here. Rebel Moon Part 2. The movie no one's been waiting for. A sequel to the movie nobody liked. And man, if you can believe it, somehow Part 2 is even worse than Part 1. Somehow every single complaint people had about the first Rebel Moon is present in the second, and even worse. Now, granted, there hasn't been a long gap between part 1 and part 2, so it's not like he went back and started fixing things in this movie, I imagine, after reception to the first one. It was probably already locked and loaded. But man, it is crazy how for 2 movies, no one sat Zack Snyder down and said, brother, this stinks. Like, he's got a couple of good ideas, he's got a couple of good shots and, like, a decent vision on, like, how things could be cool on screen. But, oh my god, it is a fucking disaster of storytelling. And not only that, it's a disaster on, like, the most basic levels of movie making. First of all, the characters in this movie are more flat than this note I'm about to hit. He's had 2 films to work with these characters, and in the first one there was no depth to them whatsoever. There was less depth to the characters in the first Rebel Moon than a goddamn kiddie pool. And somehow in the second one, they're even more like shallow. How do you do that? How do you do that? You've had 2 movies to work with these characters, and I feel like I still know nothing about them. I am more familiar with the strangers in my Rainbow Six Siege solo queuing lobby when they talk to me in text chat than I am with the characters across 4.5 hours of watching Rebel Moon. I learn more about those strangers in solo queue than I have from the characters in these movies. I don't even remember any of their names. I only know the main characters' names, like Archelaus, or like the villain Atticus, or the robot James, which is a... I'll get to the James in a moment, but it's so weird. Zack Snyder fundamentally fails with 2 movies to do what most directors can accomplish in a single episode of a TV show, and that's make you care about some characters. And it's not for lack of trying. I actually made a note of this because I found it so laughably pathetic. He is just unable to write good characters or write a compelling story around them. He tried to give them some depth. I have to set the stage narratively. So this movie is all about, super surprised, the big bad guy from Rebel Moon 1 isn't dead. We knew that. He's coming back. They have 5 days now to prepare the village and, get the grain protected and have this big war that's going to unfold on this planet. So the movie is mainly just prepping for that. It's really fucking boring. It is a snooze fest. But there is a scene, like, right before they arrive to the war where one of the characters sits everyone down at the table and basically just says, look, we don't really know each other. Why don't we go around the room and tell each other a little bit about ourselves? Like an actual icebreaker in middle school. So they go through their fucking generic sob stories one by one. And I shit you not, every single one of these is about 10 to 12 minutes in length and entirely slow motion. All slow motion. This movie has at least 5 times as much slow motion as Rebel Moon Part 1, which had an criminal amount of slow motion. Zack Snyder needs to go to, like, a psychiatrist to figure out why he is obsessed with slow-mo. In the most unnecessary scenes ever. In Rebel Moon Part 1, there's an infamous scene that I pointed out where there's I think it's like a whole 2-minute sequence of a slow-mo jog from one of the characters. Like, slowed down to, like, 0.25 speed of him just jogging for so long. And in here, that's like half of the scenes. So in this moment, they're going around the room telling their generic sob stories, which suck. They are so poorly written. Side quests in the first Mass Effect with throwaway characters gave you more reasons to care than these do. So they're going around the room, they're telling their stories, each one's 10 to 12 minutes of all slow-mo, and it's supposed to be about confessing, so we get to learn about the real them. And it falls right on its fucking face. It became a joke. Like an actual joke. This was his attempt at trying to give the characters any level of depth. This is him fleshing them out. He can't do it. He can't write it. It's bad. So, since he was unsuccessful in giving these characters any real depth, no one cares about them. No one's going to know their name. I certainly didn't. So anytime the characters do something, which is rare because most of the characters do nothing here except for the main characters, but anytime they do, you kind of just roll your eyes like, oh, who is this and what are they doing? Why? And then if something happens to those characters, it doesn't matter because you don't know them. You haven't seen them do anything, so who gives a fuck? It takes all of the emotional weight off of every single scene that they're in. And I think somewhere along the way, he recognized that because at a certain point, characters just start telling you how you're supposed to feel about characters. So there's a scene where one of the villagers is giving the main cast, like the heroes, a certain item, and then explaining why she's giving them that item. And it's like, oh, for your bravery, your no-quit attitude. There's not a mean bone in your body. You always wear the nicest smile, and you got real stars in your eyes, champ. We love it here. And it's like, what the fuck do you mean? We've never even seen that from this character. What are you talking about? You also never seen this from the character. They haven't done anything. They haven't done shit. And you're talking about how they're like super strong, super nice, like an incredible warrior. You haven't fucking seen it. Nobody has. Like, they just start telling you what the character is supposed to be, but you never see it. They don't show you it. So it sucks. Like, what Zack Snyder needs is a talented writing team around him. Because like I said, he has some cool visions, and there are some good shots. But since everything around it is dog shit, the whole thing just becomes a toilet bowl of poop. Like, it just doesn't work. So all of the shots are just kind of moot. If he had a team of writers around him that kind of wrangled in his visions and like actually fleshed them out, I think he could have something here with Rebel Moon. But since it seems like he's only surrounded by a bunch of yes men, we're going to keep getting fed this slop. And it is slop. I don't know how Zack Snyder has like this cult following that he does that's brainwashed into just loving everything he makes. It's just so odd because under every possible spin of Rebel Moon, it's just bad. Like, there's no real arguments you can make for it being good. Even at the most basic level of action, it fucking fails at. It's boring. The action in Rebel Moon 1 was better, genuinely better, than what's here in Rebel Moon 2. Even though this one is all about a war. Like, how do you make a war movie this lame? It's just a bunch of people firing from the hip in slow-mo. So just a bunch of lasers, beep booping all over the place. And you don't really get to see anything interesting. There's a fucking character that uses dual lightsabers. Like, how do you fumble that? That is the easiest recipe for just fun on screen, and still, her scenes with the dual lightsabers are terrible. She barely does anything with them. She does like a couple of moves like this and that and nothing else. And she loses like the entire time to just random grunts. And that's supposed to be like one of the main heroes there. This ultimate warrior. It's just pathetic. Like, it is boring action. Aside from a couple of decent moments. Like, there's a couple of moments in these slow-mo sequences that I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. If it wasn't surrounded by 50 other minutes worth of slow-mo, this one actually probably would have stood out. I bet if you took the slow-mo out of this movie, you would have cut its runtime by about 40 minutes. And I'm not even really exaggerating. I actually think you would have taken a huge chunk out of this movie if those slow-mo scenes were just normal speed or just used more sporadically. It's baffling. It's truly nuts how much slow-mo is in this movie. Like, I can't overstate that. But yeah, it takes so much of the impact and intensity out of a lot of these fight scenes. So really nothing in this film lands. Like, actually nothing. Now, I mentioned the robot James earlier, and I think he is the best example for just how bad and how all over the place Zack Snyder's brain is with Rebel Moon. James is a robot who actually has something cool about him. He's got, I don't want to spoil it, but he's got an interesting element that isn't present in anything else in Rebel Moon. And instead of exploring that part, which they only briefly drop, they instead just sideline him to a character that wears antlers and is occasionally just in the background looking at things. That's his whole presence in Rebel Moon. All he does is like look at shit from the sidelines and he's like, And then he eventually talks to our main character for like maybe a minute or two, and he reveals that really interesting piece of lore about him, and it's never addressed again. And instead, he pops up one more time in the middle of their climactic battle where he just, like a fucking turret, goes in a circle shooting people, and then he like punches a guy, and then blows up a tank, and then he's gone again until the end of the movie, and then he's wearing his antlers again. He's like, I think I might want to help. Clearly, he's trying to get James into the fold for the third movie, because apparently Zack Snyder wants to make 6 of these bitches. God only knows why. I have no idea why. They are terrible and looks like only getting worse. But because Zack Snyder's all over the place, he has so many different pots on the fire, he's losing track of them, is what it seems like. James is a character that was introduced in the first Rebel Moon that I thought could be interesting, only to be completely forgotten. And in this film, they bring him in pretty early, like they show you him, and I thought, oh, he's probably going to play a pretty decent role in this film. Only to be completely forgotten again until the end of the movie with that little scene with the main character and then his hero moment. And then he even strikes legitimately a hero pose, like an actual hero pose, superhero. So it's like Zack Snyder keeps forgetting where things are or what things are going on in these movies because he's probably too focused on how to put more fucking slow-mo in it. It's just so poorly done from top to bottom. I can't think of anything in this film that makes it worth watching. It's a slog. And even like what's supposed to be the big payoff with this massive battle sucks. It's boring. Anyway, I'm not going to keep ranting about Rebel Moon Part 2 here, but I do also want to mention something, the name Scargiver. So Rebel Moon Part 2 is called Scargiver, and do you want to know why? Because fuck you, that's why. He has these pretentious sounding names, and in the movie, the best I can gather, since it's not fully explored why they call her Scargiver, the best I can piece together is the main bad guy Atticus at one point says that he's going to show his face and bear the scar that she gave him. So I'm guessing it's him giving her the title of Scargiver, because in their final fight, which basically killed him and then he was brought back to life, he now has a scar from it. Genius. I could be wrong, but that's what I pieced together with the name. Everything about Rebel Moon is so fucking cringe, it's crazy. If I was to put it onto the moist meter, I'd probably give this puppy a comfortable 15%, I'd say. That's really about it. So yeah. I don't like to use the word hero often, but I think what I just did is nothing shy of one of the bravest acts mankind is possible of accomplishing. I did the unthinkable. I rewatched Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver. And there's a good reason for this. This is something no sane, ordinary mortal would ever do. Watching that dog shit movie twice, unfathomable. Makes God frown for his creation. It's a day for weeping. But in my pursuit of science, I had a valid reason to engage in this torture. I didn't even dislike Zack Snyder going into the Rebel Moon series, but since I've given my review on Part 2 of Rebel Moon, I've become a victim of the Snyder cult's incessant whining online, and I actually feel bad for them, and out of spite, I decided to prove a point with this movie. I'd always heard of the Zack Snyder cult, but I never actually saw them in action until now. I'd always just assumed it was people that appreciated his work because some of his movies are enjoyable, but he's had significantly more misses than hits throughout his career. But that doesn't bother me, it's not like that offends me, you can like whatever you like. But the Snyder cult, they fight more than any of the characters in Rebel Moon does for his glory. They defend his reputation like they are personally attacked anytime someone doesn't like his work or expresses any kind of criticism of it. It's weirdo behavior. I think the movie is atrocious, and I think the first one is bad too, but the second one is particularly special when it comes to how fucking stinky it is. I think on an objective level, it fails at everything it aims to do. I'm not going to just regurgitate all of the points I made from my review a few days ago of this. However, since I made that review, the Zack Snyder cult has been in full force on Twitter, tagging me in all of their delusional posts about why Rebel Moon Part 2 is not only the best movie of 2024, but one of the best sci-fi movies of all time, and Zack Snyder is truly a creative genius that I just can't comprehend. And the 11% on Rotten Tomatoes and all of the normal people making fun of this film just really can't grasp its highbrow sci-fi nature. We're all just a bunch of troglodyte homunculus, and Zack Snyder his wisdom is lost on us. It blows my mind how anyone could have that perspective, unless this is like the only movie you've ever seen. Like, maybe if you're like 6 years old and you just got your parents' permission to use the crayons, you'd write a letter to Zack Snyder thanking him for this film, but these are fucking adults that are singing its praises. I'm usually all for letting people have their fun, but this is another level. You're doing free PR for this guy for a movie that is horrible trash. Like, he has succeeded where MK Ultra has failed. Zack Snyder has successfully brainwashed people into accepting actual fucking wet wipes for entertainment. This is a horrible film, and I'm here to snap you out of it. I went against all of my survival instincts, and I rewatched this pile of garbage. And I timestamped every single scene that's in slow motion, explaining what the scenes were and how long the slow motion lasts, so that way I could calculate how long of its 112 minutes is spent in slow motion. Now, the movie actually has a longer runtime listed, but that includes the credits, which I am excluding from this because who the fuck cares about how long the credits are? I want to talk about the actual meat of the movie. So the actual meat of the movie is 112 minutes in length. One of the main criticisms I had, as well as every other sensible person on this planet, is that Zack Snyder has an over-reliance on slow motion, and Rebel Moon Part 2 is the biggest, most criminal execution of this obsession. It is an unbearable amount of slow motion, it is insufferably cringe, and the only scar that Rebel Moon Part 2 is giving is to its audience's patience. So let's dive in. I rewatched it, and these are my findings. Now, I think it's important to the scientific study here that I mentioned that this film had me dozing off a couple of times. I think it's nearly impossible to sit through Rebel Moon Part 2 without falling asleep at least once or twice. It had me drowsy. This shit hits harder than NyQuil. It's like the Sandman constantly throwing sand in your face with the most boring movie ever. So I think there is a good chance that I did miss some slow-mo because I just couldn't keep my eyes open for the entire runtime, which is natural. So this is going to be the bare minimum of slow-mo. There might be more that slipped under my radar when I was catching some Z's watching this. So just making note of that up top. Now, there's actually no slow-mo in their intro sequence. That's when they're giving you the lay of the land, the exposition. So for the first 14 minutes, there is no slow motion. That's a huge round of applause from me for Zack Snyder there, showing restraint, not putting slow motion in the first 14 minutes, and then all hell breaks loose. At 14 minutes and 1 second, we get our first slow-mo. It's the main character giving her backstory to her lover. So after they fuck, she starts telling him about her past. This sequence lasts from 14 minutes and 1 second to 15 minutes and 26 seconds. The flashback sequence is characters walking while she info dumps, and it is entirely in slow motion for that entire minute and 20-something seconds. It then snaps out of slow motion and picks back up at 16 minutes and 42 seconds. And at 16 minutes and 42 seconds, the main character gets betrayed in a lame scene. Guy gets stabbed, and the bad guy says, "Do it." Which, side note, I think is adorable, since this is like basically a bad Star Wars fanfiction come to life from Zack Snyder. It's very fitting that he has like a Palpatine impression here, kind of, but it's really awful. You've probably seen the clips on Twitter with people dunking on it with the "Do it" clip floating around everywhere. This is in slow motion, and it lasts from 1640 to 1701. There's then a brief respite from slow motion as it goes to normal speed, but then it goes back into slow motion at 1731 and lasts to 1748. And this is a character that gets shot and slowly falls. There's then more slow motion at 1826 and lasts to 19 minutes. And this is the characters shouting "Murderer" as the main character escapes. This is all during her flashback sequence that she's explaining to her lover. So then, after she escapes, we then go to the present. She's now no longer in a flashback, but the slow motion, don't worry, it's coming back. At 20 minutes and 41 seconds, we have our first slow motion farming sequence. So that lasts all the way up until 2054, some high quality slow-mo farming. Then there is more slow-mo farming from 2101 to 2148. This is slow-mo farming using a scythe on the grain and picking up grain and blowing some grain. There's then a break, and we get more slow motion 10 seconds later from 2154 to 2209. This is more slow-mo farming, and a guy stares romantically at a girl. Then from 2430 to 2434, there's some space birds that fly off the grain in slow motion. From 2437, so only 3 seconds after the slow motion space birds, we have more slow-mo farming with one character, again, using scythe on the grain, and then there's characters celebrating the fun of farming, and it really seems like Zack Snyder loves fucking slow-motion farming. That really puts a wet spot in his trousers, I guess, because this slow-mo farming scene goes from 2437 to 2525. If you've got like a fetish for close-up farming shots in slow motion, you're gonna have a ball with this movie, I'll tell you that much. Like, that's the only audience I could see being super satisfied with Rebel Moon Part 2. Anyway, there's more slow motion at 2611, From 26:11 to 26:31, there's a character that fills up a canteen that used to be used for alcohol, and now he's filling it with water. At 27:05, there's more slow-mo farming with some characters piling the grain. This goes from 27:05 to 27:20. Then at 28:30, there's more slow-mo farming, pouring grain into bags. This goes from 28:30 to 28:55. At 29:01, there's a character dropping a grain bag onto the camera for a transition. So this is a pretty short shot. It's 29:01 to 29:04 there. Now hang on to your hats, sailors, because I got a stunning revelation for you here. We actually get over 10 minutes without slow motion here. At least no slow motion that I caught. There's a chance that I may have been catching some Z's at this point perhaps and I missed some. But we get over 10 minutes with no slow motion because it's entirely characters vomiting the most poorly written exposition I've ever heard into each other's mouths. Zack Snyder cannot show anything for a story. He can only tell it. The things he shows are excruciatingly painful slow motion moments. So all of the character building attempts that he tries to make are just characters telling you how you should feel about other characters. It's trash. But we get over 10 minutes of that, and it's at least at normal speed. So we go from 29:04 all the way up to 41 minutes without slow motion. And then the slow motion kicks off again, starting at 41:20 and lasting for over a minute 30. It goes from 41:20 all the way up to 42:40. And this is that scene I mentioned in my review where this is Zack Snyder's attempt to try and flesh out the characters. So he has the characters sit down and say, hey, we're all kind of like strangers, right? What are we fighting for? Tell me a little bit about yourself. They play a middle school icebreaker. So they go through and just tell their generic sob stories, and Zack Snyder plays a slow motion flashback sequence for all of them. So the first one is 41:20 to 42:48. This is a character telling his slow-mo backstory about being the general and his men being killed, and he doesn't like that. He's pretty unsatisfied there. Then the next character goes up. Her backstory lasts from 43:30 to 44:58, and her backstory is another generic sob story. And then another character goes up, and her backstory slow motion sequence lasts from 45:15 to 47:02. Her backstory is not as generic, by the way. This is the lightsaber lady. The problem is, he made lightsabers not cool. So in her flashback, the lightsabers are kind of fucking lame. Somehow Zack Snyder found a way to make his bootleg lightsabers uninteresting. Like, they're visually cool, but he uses them for nothing but the most basic moves and doesn't do anything creative with it, so it's such a fucking shame. But at least her story's not nearly as generic as the others, though it does last a long time in slow motion, like everything in his movie. Then the next character goes, and their backstory goes from 47:23 to 48:59. This is another character telling their generic sob story in slow motion, but this one has a woman doing the Titanic pose as she jumps off of a building in slow-mo. We then have another brief break, if you can believe that. We go another 10 minutes without slow motion. Boy, howdy, you've done it, Zach. Double digits again with no slow motion, at least none that I caught. And then the battle starts. So this is during all their prepping, like when they were prepping for this war that was about to unfold here at the village against the bad guys. All of that prepping, from what I could see and what I was awake for, was in normal speed. Then the battle starts, and it's strap in. We got a lot of slow-mo to cover. So at 1 hour, 5 minutes, 33 seconds, there's an explosion. And that explosion lasts from then all the way until 1 hour, 5 minutes, and 55 seconds. That's a long time for a slow motion explosion. I think we got the point, but whatever. Then at 107:32, from 107:32 to 107:36, there's a guy who gets ready to throw a grenade. Then it's in normal speed for 2 seconds, and then it's slow-mo again. At 107:38 to 107:45, he throws the grenade. Then it's normal speed for 10 seconds and goes back to slow-mo. From 107:55 to 108:04, he runs away from the explosion caused from the grenade. Then it's back into normal speed for about 21 seconds, and we pick up again with slow-mo. At 108:24 to 108:59, this is the lightsaber girl having her first fight. And this is really insulting because there's 2 layers deep of slow-mo. This is a scene you've probably seen on Twitter with people making fun of it because it's trash. It's the worst action choreography you'll ever find with lightsabers. She's supposed to be this elite warrior with these blades, yet she uses them like she's playing Beat Saber with them. She seems like she's using these lightsabers for the first time. So this lightsaber fight lasts entirely in slow-mo, but two different kinds. There's normal slow-mo, and then there's super duper wumbo slow-mo, where anytime she makes contact with someone, it is excruciatingly slow. Like I said, you've seen the clip on Twitter most likely with people making fun of it. So like she trips a guy, and then the slow-mo slows down even slower. Oh, it's bad. It's so bad. So that lasts for a while. Then at 109.15 to 109.29, it's a guy getting punched. So a guy gets punched, and then it slow-mos his, like, ooh, for so long. Like, the common thread here is he uses slow-mo in pretty much every single action moment, even non-action moments. There's actually just random moments of slow-mo throughout this film. But anytime he uses it, he lets it go on for so long, and it's supposed to give, like, an emphasis to it, but all it does is take all of the impact out of it. It becomes a slog and a chore to sit through action sequences in this movie, because they're so slow and dragged for so long. Like, I get it, this guy got punched. I don't need to see him, like, recoil for, like, 15 seconds of slow-mo. It's unnecessary. Next up, at 1:10:10 to 1:10:20, a bad guy throws a guy. The throw's in slow motion. Then at 1:11:06 to 1:11:20, a guy falls out of an aircraft. So we watch him fall out of an aircraft slowly, and then he splats on the ground. It's a PG-13 movie, so it's not like he explodes into gore or anything. It's not TF2. He doesn't get, like, insta-gibbed or whatever. But he falls out of the aircraft, and you see him splat all in slow motion. Then we have a 3-minute break from slow-mo, and that's kind of cool. It's normal speed nothingness for a little bit. Then we get more slow motion because the lightsaber lady's back, and every single one of her scenes is pretty much slow-mo when she's fighting. At 1:14 to 1:14:16, the lightsaber lady gets her robo-hand chopped off. Then at 1:14:29, we go back to slow motion. She's getting beat up, and that's from 1:14:29 to 1:14:45. It's just the lightsaber lady losing, mostly. Like, she's killing a couple grunts, like one or two, kinda. But, again, this is supposed to be like a super elite warrior. I wouldn't think she'd be struggling against actual nobodies. So, this just makes her character look even less cool. Because she's struggling against fucking grunts. And it's all in slow motion, of course. Obviously. Then at 1:15:19 all the way to 1:16:23, over a minute of slow-mo, we have our good guys that are charging at the bad guys, shooting at them or hitting them with axes, all with no cover, right out in the open, only a couple of feet from an entire horde of bad guys that are all shooting lasers at them, yet every single laser is missing the good guys. It's the worst instance of stormtrooper aim I've ever seen in a movie. And this is all in slow motion, obviously, and you get to see just how goofy it is. Then we go back to the lightsaber lady at 1:17 all the way to 1:17:20. The lightsaber lady loses again in slow-mo. And then at 1:17:30, so only 13 seconds after losing, she loses again, all in slow-mo. And that goes from 1:17:30 to 1:17:40. So she loses, but at this point takes a bad guy with her. So she doesn't go to the grave alone here, all in slow-mo. At 1:19:16 to 1:19:21, a guy who got punched earlier, the guy I mentioned that got punched in slow-mo, is now running in slow-mo over to the body of the lightsaber lady. Jiminy Christmas. Then we had one of the most painful slow motion sequences here, because I have no doubt Snyder fans thought this was fucking epic, but it's so bad in the movie. At 1:19:52, all the way to 1:21:04, again, over a minute of pure slow motion, we have the good guys going hog wild. We got a good guy who kicks a guy in a chest while getting shot at from the bad guys right in front of him, missing every fucking laser shot. It is an army of foot soldiers all shooting at these guys with no cover and still missing every shot in slow motion. and the good guy kicks a guy over like a little bridge thing, and he falls into the water all in slow motion. Over a minute of it. Oh. And then at 121:42 to 121:54, the good guys think they've won for beating the first wave of enemies. So they start celebrating like, we did it! The bad guys are defeated! Woo-loo-loo! Yeah, SpongeBob victory screech! Only to find out that was just one wave of enemies. So then there's another wave of enemies coming, and they start shooting at them, so they're dodging the lasers in slow motion. At 122:02 to 122:10, there's lasers hitting everything but the good guys, including hitting houses and bells. So there's like a slow-mo sequence of like this tank's Gatling gun of lasers missing all of the human beings and just shooting a bell. At 124:50, so over 2 minutes worth of no slow motion. Not bad, Snyder. But it comes back at 124:50 to 125:02. A tank blows up a building. So you see the explosion in slow motion. At 126:22 to 126:27, the tank shoots at an empty building. So slow motion, you're seeing lasers piercing an empty building. At 126:29 to 126:31, the tank keeps shooting a building in slow motion. At 126:33 to 126:45, a lady shoots a rocket at that tank and then falls over. At 127:20 to 127:24, the main character jumps doing like a, I don't know, like some kind of kickflip motion with her legs, and she shoots at some people below her. From 131:08 to 131:30, the army is moving with another tank. You're probably picking up on a trend here. It's pretty much when any character is moving or doing anything besides talking, Zack Snyder puts it in slow motion for some fucking reason. At 132:20 to 132:34, we get Robot James coming into the mega mix here. Robot James, who's done nothing for 2 fucking movies now, shows up, and he's just like the lightsaber lady in that pretty much all of his scenes are in slow motion. Yippee. So Robot James is in a hero stance from this entire slow motion sequence. At 132:40 to 133:03, Robot James beats up some bad guys and starts shooting at them. From 133:05 to 133:13, Robot James jumps on a tank and opens the hatch. At 133:23 to 134:04, Robot James drops a grenade in the hatch and blows up the tank and strikes another hero pose and really lets that hero pose marinate. At 138:20 to 138:38, there's an explosion in the main evil ship. At 139:40 to 139:52, the final fight is occurring, and the main character kicks the bad guy. He then does like 3 super spins in the air like some kind of gymnast while making a really silly facial expression. At 140:35 to 140:41, the bad guy tackles the main character. From 140:44 to 140:52, the bad guy throws the main character, and she's like slowly falling after being thrown. From 143:14 to 143:30, the ship is falling and the good guys are escaping. After saving the day, obviously. From 148:15 to 148:22, they're burning their fallen comrades' bodies. So this is now like a funeral, and we're watching the bodies burn in slow motion. From 148:56 to 149:06, those banners that I mentioned in my review that they gave to once again try and vomit some reasons for you to care about these 2-dimensional flat fucking shallow characters, well, those banners are now burning for the couple of them that passed away. And then at 152:10, the best moment of the movie happens. It ends. The credits roll. So, that was a lot of slow motion, huh? Well, don't worry. I did the math. I think I got all the numbers in here. There were so many to keep track of in my fucking notes here. I have to scroll for like actually 15 seconds to go through every single slow-mo instance here. But I think I got all of the numbers, and it came out to 1,256 seconds, or 20 minutes and 56 seconds worth of slow motion in Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver. That is an outrageous amount of time to be caught in fucking slow motion. It makes the movie feel like it's 3 times as long, because everything is dragging. It's like watching a movie in molasses. It's like that drug from the movie Dread, slow-mo, where everything just fucking comes to a screeching halt. It is painful. So just shy of 21 minutes worth of slow motion in this movie. So out of 112 minutes, 21 minutes is spent in slow motion, which is roughly like 19% of the overall movie is spent in slow-mo. That's crazy. It's actually less than I thought, though. I thought it was going to be significantly more minutes. I really did. Like, I've exaggerated a lot, but I really thought we'd be pushing deep into the 30 minutes worth of slow-mo. Because when I think about this film, it's hard to think of any scene that's in normal speed. Because pretty much every scene has slow motion in it. That is completely laughable, especially considering I think there's a pretty good chance I actually missed some slow motion scenes from being so drowsy while watching this. Like, I really can't imagine how you can come up with a justification for that much slow-mo. It's too much, especially in the places it's used. It doesn't add anything. In fact, most of the time it takes away from the scenes. Like I mentioned, there are some cool scenes in the movie. But when everything is in slow motion, you get exhausted from it. So scenes that I think would be cool on their own in slow motion start to lose their luster, take the wind out of their sails, because you've been surrounded by so much of it throughout this film that you just get fucking tired of it. And also, the cool scenes would be really elevated if there was good writing present in this film, which there just isn't. If there was a better narrative crafted here with characters that actually had real depth and real reasons to care about them, then I think a lot of the scenes could have hit much harder, especially if you take away slow-mo from other parts that didn't need it. Why is there so much slow-mo farming, for instance? Why? It doesn't add any emphasis to it. It just drags on a montage of farming. Like, Jesus Christ. So, here's all the facts about Rebel Moon's slow-mo. We got the cold hard data here, and it confirms what all of us knew. That this movie has too much fucking slow motion, and Zack Snyder is way too obsessed with slow-mo as a tool in his films. Someone needs to tell him that enough is enough, stop using it for everything. Yeah, this movie's trash, though. That's really about it. See ya. Zack Snyder has released the director's cut, the R-rated versions of Rebel Moon Part 1 and 2, and I watched both of them. I need to wash my mouth out with soap. That just hurts to say. I have become one of the preeminent experts on disliking Rebel Moon Part 1 and 2. I hate-watched it to a level that is genuinely unhealthy. I actually watched Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver, twice. The second time was out of spite to prove a point, where I went through and painstakingly documented every single instance of slow-mo to get the exact amount of time that the film spends in slow motion, which is a curse I wouldn't wish upon my worst enemy. I also thoroughly explained the scenes that slow motion was used in, because it's just an egregious amount used for no reason most of the time in the movie. Zack Snyder has become infamous for how much slow-mo he uses, and in Rebel Moon, he doesn't even use it to emphasize cool shit. He just seems to randomly use it to fill some type of sick fetish. Like, maybe he signed a deal with the devil, and part of the contract was he has to include an extreme amount of slow motion in his movies, so he just pads the time with it. I'll go ahead and spoil the analytics for you here, I guess. So, from my calculations, when I went through and timestamped everything, it came out to 20 minutes and 56 seconds of Rebel Moon Part 2 is spent purely in slow motion, and sometimes the slow-mo goes 2 layers deep, where a slow motion scene will actually slow itself down for even more intense slow-mo, which drags it out even further. And like I said, he just randomly puts slow motion in these movies for no reason, so it's not even used in action scenes a lot of the times. So in Part 2, a lot of slow motion is used when they're farming. Slow motion farming. When they're like taking a scythe to some hay, or if they're just throwing some grain, there's a lot of slow motion tossing of grain. So if you're someone who's very enthusiastic about watching bags of grain get thrown through the air in very slow speeds, your wishes have been answered with Rebel Moon Part 2. Zack Snyder's got you covered. But anyway, on to the R-rated version. This is supposed to be like the definitive Snyder cut. This is his original vision. Apparently what he did is he filmed Rebel Moon Part 1 and 2 as R-rated films, but then chopped them up to be PG-13 for Netflix, which I think makes no sense, because it's not like you went to theaters, you went to streaming, and it's not like R-rated movies flop on streaming. Like, you could have just released the definitive cut. And now after seeing it, it's very clear that a lot was missing from Part 1 and 2, which led to the narrative being a lot weaker in what he put out. I don't know why Zack Snyder can't just release the complete version of his films the first time around. Instead, he has to double dip with a fucking follow-up cut. But I do want to make it clear, the R-rated director's cut version doesn't save either one of these films. They're still not good, but they are better. So let's start with Rebel Moon Part 1 Director's Cut. I wrote some notes here so that way I didn't miss anything. There does seem to be quite a few changes well, not changes. Everything that was in the original cut is still there, so all the slow motion is still just such a fucking headache. But some of the things that were added was a lot of gore, a lot of blood, guts, and titties. And he made sure to order it with extra titty. He randomly inserts boobies here like he uses them for jump scares. I guess he really wanted to make sure to use every possible element of an R rating he could think of, but couldn't think of ways to naturally include nudity, so he just decided to just haphazardly throw it in here for some reason. And he makes sure to include some more fucks, of course. But anyway, the intro sequence to Rebel Moon Part 1, I actually thought was pretty solid. The blood and gore do help enhance the action a little bit, but the way Zack Snyder uses it makes it very reminiscent of the live-action Death Note, if you remember that on Netflix a long time ago, where people would just explode all the time like they were just these giant meat balloons that were one, like, small needle poke away from just blowing up into intestines flying over the place and blood splattering across the screen. That's how Zack Snyder uses it in this movie. So if someone gets shot, their whole fucking arm flies off, and you got like fingers and bones popping out all over the place. You know, people getting shot in the face, and all of a sudden their brain matter shoots out all over the place. Or someone gets shot in the shoulder, and it pops their butthole out of their shoulder. Like, it's actually comical. Like, seeing someone get stabbed or shot, and then just having all of their limbs explode off of them actually had me giggling a little bit. It does make the action a bit cooler, but kind of in like a silly way, if that makes sense. So, like, an example. Whenever someone uses a knife, like even just like a normal knife, they'll stab someone, and then when they take the knife out, it's this eruption of blood. Like, it's like a whole fountain of blood shoots out of them. It's so over the top that it is entertaining. But I don't know if it's on purpose, or if Zack Snyder really just thought it was cool that if someone gets like a paper cut, all of a sudden the blood shoots out like a geyser, like a volcano erupting into blood. I did like it though. Like I said, it is entertaining, but it is just kind of comical. Anytime someone gets shot, you bet your sweet bippy there's body parts getting blown off of them in every which way. But it certainly helps this movie be less boring, because Jesus Christ, the original Rebel Moon Part 1, almost impossible to stay awake for. Same with Part 2. These are snooze fest movies. So the R rating does help because you're dozing off because of terrible exposition and horrible writing, and then all of a sudden someone steps on a nail and their whole foot blows off and hits the screen and there's blood dripping all over the screen, and you're like, oh, alright, I'm awake again. I keep going off on tangents here. I just have a whole lot to say about it because it's something special. So back to the intro sequence. I do enjoy it, but man, oh man, it's pretty fucking dumb. I wrote a couple things down. So, like, there's this little alien that's in a cage, and there are some people running away as the mother world is coming after them. Everything's gone to shit, and the mother world's here wreaking havoc on this planet, about to just obliterate everyone and everything. And there's this family that's running away, and they have this little alien in a cage. Well, the alien gets dropped, and then the lead guy of the scene picks up the little alien, and he says, "They want to hurt her. I'm sorry." And then the alien, it's like this cute little CGI thing. He's like, okay. Well, he doesn't say okay, but he's like nodding his head like he understands this is a dire situation. So the little alien guy starts hopping around, and it's like an adorable little creature. I was rooting for him. And then he stands in front of the soldiers that are invading their world, and he does this. And then blows up. The little alien guy explodes. He just blows himself up like Voltorb casting self-destruct and takes out, I don't know, like 20 soldiers or something, which ultimately does nothing because then just another wave of soldiers come in and murder the family and take their son to turn him into a soldier. And during this scene, Zack Snyder makes it immediately clear that there's gonna be boob. Come hell or high water, hunkers will arrive. So during this invasion, randomly, there's just like some women that are getting taken by the soldiers, and they're taking their clothes off. Like just leaving them bare ass naked and then branding them. And they do that for like 2 or 3 women. And then that's never touched on again. It's just there to illustrate like, oh, these are some like really evil people. But it's an entirely unnecessary thing to include. He's already fully established that this group is not good. They're a bunch of jerks, to say the least. Pardon my French. Like, he didn't need to do that. Like, we're watching a war, and we're watching the general do some fucked up garbage with this family, and then randomly it's like, okay, now take her clothes off. Do it now. It's like, what the fuck, Zach? Like, I get it's R-rated, but that scene didn't add anything. It was just weird. It was just like a weird thing to include, in my opinion. It really just feels like there are some moments that just come out of nowhere. Again, like the little alien doing a Chaozu impression from Dragon Ball, where like Chaozu grabs onto Nappa and blows up. That's exactly what the little alien did for no reason. And I just really get that impression that a lot of things happen here for no reason, just because he wanted to make sure people knew this is an R-rated movie. So when we first go to the farm planet, when they're on Velt, the first fucking thing we see here, I wrote this down because I wanted to make sure I got the quotes right. So they're in this village, they're in this hall, and they're talking about the upcoming harvest. And the head of the community says that the optimal way to ensure a successful, good harvest is everyone going and having sex. Like, everyone's just super horny. It's like a giant orgy community is like the first impression you get of it. He says verbatim, "Fuck hard tonight. Fuck for the harvest." Those are his exact words. Like, it's so horny for no reason. And then right after that, they play some, like, music in the hall to get everyone, like, ready to go have sex for the harvest. And then our main character, Cora, or Arthaleus, she then goes and has sex with a dude that looks like Hugh Jackman. He's also in the second movie, but I keep forgetting his name. I'm pretty sure it's Din. And the sex scene lasts for so long. It is such a long, uncomfortable scene. Like, it drags for a long time. I'm shocked there wasn't slow-mo used during the sex scene. Like, I think Zack Snyder thought he was shooting porn at this point. Like, it totally loses the plot. It didn't need to be that long. And, it's full nudity and everything, but, like, it doesn't add anything. Like, what? At no point in the rest of the film or in the second film does having sex for the harvest come up. It's just in this director's cut in the very beginning of this film, and I just don't get why. It's just because he seems to want another excuse to show honkers. Like, he just wants to have yams out at all times, I guess. But it's more than just the sex and blood that gets added to the director's cut. He added a lot of lore. So lore that really should have been there in the PG-13 version is there in this version. It's not like there's profanity or anything used in it, and there's not like gore for some of these scenes. There are just like actual world building elements in the director's cut that weren't there in the PG-13 cut, and I don't understand why. I don't get why. I got a lot more about the universe in the director's cut than I ever did in the first one. Though it doesn't help with character development, it doesn't help flesh out any characters at all. The lore bits that get added here, the tiddlywinks of lore that get included, are for the bigger scale of the world, which is helpful, obviously, but it still suffers from the same problem the PG-13 cuts do, where the characters are still so fucking flat and have no depth to them whatsoever. That was not fixed in the director's cut of these movies. And some of those scenes are actually really cool. Like, I've always said, Zack Snyder has some really cool set pieces and cool moments, but he can't write for shit. Across, 7 hours and 2 movies, he has failed to do what some TV shows capture in a single episode, making you care about the characters and the universe. He still hasn't done that, even with those director's cuts now, in my opinion. But there are some really cool scenes. He just needs to surround himself with some writers that can actually breathe life into this, and he can just focus on some cool shots, cool action. Like, that's what he is best at. I don't know why he doesn't just bring in some writing talent to help him realize these things. But anyway, I want to talk some more about some of the new additions to Rebel Moon Part 1. So, when they first meet Kai, it's pretty different here. So, they go to a brothel, because, of course, I mean, hey, R-rated Rebel Moon, baby. So they all go to a brothel, and things kind of play out similarly to the PG-13 cut when they first meet Kai and everything. However, there's a couple of things that are different. There's like a nipple robot that has some screen time for some reason, And when they leave the brothel, the nipple robot is shown coming out and then like looking in their direction. So I was actually led to believe we were about to get like a whole new DLC character here with the nipple robot, but you never see them again in the rest of that movie or in the second movie. So I don't really know what the point of the nipple robot was. Maybe just because it looked cool? Maybe? I don't really know. Anyway, though, aside from just that, there is an alien pervert who tries to have sex with Gunner. So he was trying to purchase Gunner for some sex, which gets shut down saying, hey, thanks for the offer, bub, but I'll have to pass. And then the alien pervert grabs his meat, like actually gives him the old dick twist. And for some reason, that actually, like, they hold that for a little while. So he was just there, like, fondling his balls. And I wrote down the line he says because it was a doozy. I actually rewound it so that way I could catch all of it. He said, I'm gonna fuck that pretty pink hole on his face. Bravo. Now that's cinema. Wow. Wow. That is Insano-style dialogue right there. But you should expect nothing less from Rebel Moon Director's Cut, baby. The gloves are off. I'm not just going to keep focusing on some of the weird new scenes here. It's no point in doing that. If you already had no interest in watching Rebel Moon, the Director's Cut isn't going to do anything to get you interested. Or if you already tried it and didn't like it, it doesn't do anything to make you like it more. I do think it is better, but it's also hard to have been worse. It's 3 hours and 24 minutes, so it's obviously a big time investment. You gotta set aside like a whole fucking afternoon to watch it in one sitting. But the blood and gore do add to it. I appreciate the new lore that they added with some of the scenes. And I also really liked what they did with the Dreadnought. So that really cool design with that face that has like all the tubes running in it and running out of it, which kind of powers the entire Dreadnought. They actually built a lot around that in part 1 and part 2. A lot is very generous, but they built around that quite a bit. That set up something very big in the universe. So that is like the engine of the ship, and it's sentient. It's alive. It's kind of like this being that they've trapped and forced to power their ship for like, you know, these hyperspace jumps. And it cries. And Arthaleus is able to kind of connect with it, and we get a lot of lore about it in part 2. And it's pretty interesting, actually. So there's a reference to her sisters that she believes will be woken up by Arthaleus after blowing her up. But it sets up this idea that there are beings like this, capable of like crazy cosmic powers that we might see down the line. So that's pretty cool. I did like that, and I was pretty interested in that. But anyway, let's just move on to part 2. So part 2, it doesn't actually have a lot different about it. A lot of what's different in part 2 is just blood and gore. I didn't notice too many additional scenes. Part 1 I noticed quite a bit had changed, but part 2 stayed relatively the same. So the only new scenes I noticed were obviously the stuff I was talking about with the ship's engine, and then a couple of sex scenes. So, like, there's another really long sex scene with Arthaleus and Gunner. They're switching positions. They're hitting every position in the book. They're running through the entire Kama Sutra's worth of every possible sex position. It goes on for so fucking long. Lots of moaning. Totally unnecessary. It's just uncomfortably long again. And then there's like another pseudo sex scene towards the end of the movie where we abruptly cut to Tarek and some woman post-coitus, and she sits up in bed and her breasts are just out. And Tarek looks at her and then like at her milkers, and we just hold on this scene for like 40 seconds. There's like no talking or anything, and then it just abruptly cuts back to them getting ready for the upcoming fight. It comes out of nowhere. It leads to nothing. It does nothing. I don't know who that woman was. Like, it makes no sense. Again, this just feels like Zack Snyder randomly inserting titties as much as he can. I don't know what the idea was behind it. Maybe there's a deeper message there that I missed. I'm too stupid to pick up on it. But it just seems so stupid. And then there's also another set of additional scenes where there's this group of aliens that is spying on them. So I wrote down their names. I think they're called Hawkshaws. And what they're doing is they're spying on them with these binoculars and reporting back to the Dreadnought. But it doesn't change anything. So in the PG-13 cut, everything still plays out exactly the same in the director's cut here. But the Hawkshaws are now spying on them this whole time, and it doesn't change the outcome. Nothing gets altered. They're only there a couple of times and don't add anything. They then notice that the heroes have a dropship, and right when they're about to report that to the Dreadnought, which would actually change how the story played out, they get killed by the robot. So ultimately, their scenes are completely useless. It actually felt like those scenes were filmed after the PG-13 version as just a way of putting some new stuff in the R-rated version. Like, because it doesn't contribute anything. We don't learn anything about the Hawkshaws or anything, and they don't actually matter at all. So it just feels like a completely worthless side quest that's there for no reason. And that's how I feel about a couple other scenes in part 2. They just don't lead to anything. It just feels like they're spliced in there, but don't directly tie into the plot. Like they're isolated in their own thing that doesn't actually affect the timeline. It's just, I don't get the point, really. So that was kind of stupid, but that's another new addition to the director's cut. The bulk of the new stuff in part 2 director's cut is just extended action scenes with more blood and gore, and a couple of additional action scenes with more blood and gore. Which is cool, like it helps, it makes the final fight more interesting, that's for damn sure. So the final fight, some of the slow-mo doesn't look nearly as goofy in the director's cut version as the PG-13 version, because in the PG-13 version, they'd have a slow-motion scene of someone just like falling off a bridge for 6 uninterrupted seconds and nothing's really changing, whereas here, that same scene now has like some body parts flying around and like some blood going in this direction and a couple of other things happening in the back, so it is more interesting. It does help, but it doesn't save the movie. I still think Rebel Moon Part 1 and 2 are not worth watching. They're just not very good. But if Zack Snyder had just released these complete versions the first time around, the Rebel Moon series wouldn't be nearly as much of a joke as it is right now. Because at the very least, they're not as boring. Just straight up, they're not as boring anymore. The enhanced action sequences do help in that regard. Now he just needs to bring in some writers. Maybe he'll do that for Part 3. Who knows? But yeah, I do think the director's cuts are better versions of Rebel Moon Part 1 and 2. But I still think I just wasted like 7 hours watching these. I would love if Zack Snyder could just release the full, complete version the first time around. It'd be so much better. So that way I wouldn't have to watch Rebel Moon Part 1 twice and Rebel Moon Part 2 3 fucking times. But yeah, I mean, I didn't have to do that, but I did anyway. That's about it. See ya.